Hello and welcome all to our research talks. We'll begin in just a few seconds as the room fills up. If you've come to the last session, attend the last session in the E.A.T in India series, then you're in the right place. And we welcome you all to our research talks around themes emerging from ongoing research work in the design archives at NID, National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, by scholars, artists, and other practitioners from institutions around the world. NID Archives is the collection of materials, including images, objects, design prototypes, drawings, and many other different kinds of original documents, including audiovisual material. This collection is housed in what we call the KMC, the Knowledge Management Center, and also distributed throughout the departments and can be accessed for research and teaching purposes. We are hoping to launch our online archives catalog later this year, so please watch out for that announcement. NID Archives acquires and preserves material of value specifically to institutional history and broadly to design history, especially in India, but also its global linkages. NID Archives seeks to be a place for inquiry, inspiration, and research. Its mission is to enrich people's lives by promoting research, knowledge, and enjoyment of the design world. Over the past several years, researchers, artists, designers, scholars have gotten in touch with us at NID Archives for research work and writing on design on various themes and practices. And the idea is for these public programs to engage with this part of design history and the research work done by the scholars from our archives, as well as contemporary design discourse in the subcontinent, where NID and people associated with NID have made a significant contribution. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleagues from the archives team, Shreyasi Pathak, Lalita Polaru, Dhananjay, Bhakruti, and Ashin with us today, and I am Tanishka Kachru. But most importantly, I would like to introduce our collaborator for the series, Suvani Suri, who was formerly a colleague at NID teaching in the New Media Design Department and is currently an independent intermedia artist practicing in New Delhi. Suvani will introduce the series in a short while, but I'd just like to say that the format for this session, like our other sessions, will be to have our guest speaker talk, and then after that we have sort of a lengthy Q&A. So we're really looking forward to having your questions in the Q&A box and your comments in the chat box. You can time them out at any point, and the speakers will either respond live or also type back answers. So I welcome Suvani to introduce the series.
Thanks a lot, Tanishka, for the introductions. And hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the fifth and final session of this series. And a huge thanks to NID Archives, KMC, for setting this up, supporting and facilitating the series. And for all the speakers who've been a part of the session so far. So over the last few weeks, we've actually been deliberating with our speakers and participants upon the various strands that constitute a rather incredible and intriguing program that took place in the late 60s, early 70s in India, which was led by the E.A.T, acronym for Experiments in Art and Technology. The E.A.T was an organized collective of artists, scientists, and engineers that was founded by Billy Kluwer, Robert Rauschenberg, and Robert Whitman in 1966 in New York to forge a space of creative exchange between experimental art practices and emerging technologies during that period. So as a part of the India chapter, which sort of took place in the late 1960s, It ran from 1969 to 71, to be more specific. There were several artists who visited the country for specific periods to, work on their own independent inquiries and to collaborate, teach, study, and perform. As a part of this, NID Ahmedabad was one of the sites that hosted the artists and engineers, and it witnessed and participated in some of these interdisciplinary transfers and exchanges that took the shape of workshops, pedagogical exercises, performances, and exhibitions. So the ongoing series of the NID public program pivots around this period of the E.A.T happenings. And the attempt here is to sort of reopen and reread the chapter from where we are located now. There are various critical questions and reflections that underscore the series for us. And these are questions around institutional archives, collective infrastructures, cultural diplomacy, the techno-political sort of backdrop and impulses of the milieu, as well as the artistic practices, desires, and motivations that continue to build in the gaps and traces left behind from them. So in today's session, which is actually a bit of a detour from the E.A.T, but also in a way a return, and we'll see how, we are really thrilled to have with us Nakai, who's joining us from Tokyo. You will be taking us through his very sort of lively research into the archives of artist and composer David Tudor. Nakai makes music and musicians, dance and dancers, haunted musical mansions, nursery rhymes, and other forms of performances as a member of No Collective, and publishes experimental children's books written by children and other literary oddities as a member of Already Not Yet. No Collective has been selected by the Leonardo Music Journal as one of the musicians under 40 who is doing interesting things with technology and is currently conducting a virtual ensemble in residency at the University of Virginia, working with composers to create music that can only be performed and experienced on Zoom. In addition to his artistic activity, Yu has been engaged in extensive research on David Tudor's music, the results of which have been recently compiled into a book, Reminded by the Instruments. You can find the link to the companion website for the book in the chat here. Yu is also currently affiliated with the University of Tokyo, where he teaches archi choreographies and the archaeology of influence, as well as at the Kyoto City University of Arts, where he teaches fake Western music history and experimental pet sounds. Today's talk by Yu will focus on a particular recording, a monobird, that David Tudor made during his stay at NID in late 1969 using the Moog Synthesizer that he'd installed in India's quote-unquote first electronic music studio. Now, Tudor personally disliked the Moog, but certain circumstances pushed him to try out recording and performances with the instrument during his stay at NID. And he went on to record what he did, subsequently using the same recording as a sound source in various performances across the 70s. So you will be taking us through these recordings, photographs, diagrams, schematics, and recollections that reveal the unexpected trajectory of the Monobird, and also offer a glimpse into the possibilities of working through archives. Yu, thank you very much for being a part of the series with us. We are incredibly excited about the session. Tanishka has already sort of laid out the housekeeping rules of the session. So you can drop in your Q&A into the Q&A box as we proceed. And the chat is also going to be open for other comments and shares. So with that, I'll be turning over to Yu to begin his session.
Can I share my screen now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sivani, for the introduction, and thank you, Shirayasi and Tanishka, and all the other people at NID for inviting me here. And I'm a bit camera shy, so I often find it uncomfortable to talk in these online sessions showing my face. But recently I found a nice solution to this problem, so I'll be using this photo of me wearing a mask of my own face while I talk, if that's okay. And as Suvani mentioned, I have been researching the music of David Tudor for quite a long time now. And this all happened, started a bit over 10 years ago when I found his papers in the archives of the Getty Research Institute, which is an art institution located in Los Angeles, California. And in my research, I have been focusing mostly on Tudor's use of different musical instruments, both acoustic and electronic, and how he developed his music from his engagement with these specific instruments. And that is one of the reasons why my book is titled Reminded by the Instruments. And the primary part of my research is archival, and I try to connect the actual instruments that Tudor made and used with his diagrams, schematics, sketches, and other various materials to figure out what each instrument did and how Tudor used it. And recently, especially after my book came out earlier this year, I've been hearing people calling this kind of investigation forensic musicology, which has a nice ring to it since I'm a big fan of forensic architecture. Though I also like to think of it as a form of puzzle solving, putting various materials together like puzzle pieces to reconstruct a past event. Especially since this kind of approach was inspired by Tudor's own love of puzzles and the particular ways he set out to solve them. Now, there is an obvious difficulty that this kind of approach faces in the current pandemic situation, which is that I have not been able to do any new archival research for the past 2 years almost. And so which means that for the presentation today, I must rely on only on materials that I've collected previously when I wasn't thinking of any specific connection to the National Institute of Design. So the story I am presenting will be full of holes and gaps here and there, although fortunately many of these holes could be filled by other stories and materials that have been presented in this wonderful series of lectures. So I'm quite glad that I came last in that sense. And as I wrote in my synopsis, my story this evening revolves around one particular recording that David Tudor created during his stay at the National Institute of Design in late 1969. And as Alex Keefe and Paul Purgas have both detailed in their research, Tudor was in Ahmedabad between October and December of that year, 1969, to establish what is called the first electronic music studio in India. And the primary instrument he installed there was a Moog Synthesizer. And the recording I will be talking about was made using this instrument. But instead of starting my story in Ahmedabad of late 1969, I will start 10 years later in 1979 and go back in time from there. At the end of my talk, I want to add a short coda of sorts that tells the story of why I am here today talking about David Tudor, because I realized recently how this story of the story, so to speak, also turns out to be related to E.A.T's activities in India in a rather surprising way. So with that preliminary remark, I would like to begin now. And since this session is just me, I'll be talking for about 15 minutes or so, or to an hour. And so first the story, and then the story of the story. The first part of the story is called The Mysterious Affair at Zena. On the evening of February 28, 1979, David Tudor performed a concert in a New York discotheque, or at least he attempted to do so. This venue was a popular nightclub called Xenon, located half a block away from Times Square and frequented by rock stars, movie stars, and other celebrities of the day. The occasion, however, was not a dance party, but a benefit for a non-profit artist organization called the Institute for Art and Urban Resources that had been turning unused buildings and city-owned properties in New York into alternative art spaces for about a decade by then. This organization had been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts Challenge grant, which required them to raise private funds to match the grant money. So Billy Kluver and Julie Martin of E.A.T decided to organize a fundraiser titled Artists for New York. The strange arrangement to hold a support event for a New York avant-garde organization at a posh disco came about through the lawyer and labor mediator Theodore Kill, who had been a longtime board member of E.A.T. and happened to also be a law partner of the lawyer who was working for the owners of Xenon. Billy and Julie rallied the entire New York art community for the event, as can be seen in this impressive list of artists who joined the committee for this event. And the famous gallerist Leo Castelli was to host the evening. The artist James Rosenquist created a poster for the event in which he overlaid an image of colorful dancing laser beams on a blackened collage of pornographic images. The design of this poster reflected the context, since before opening its doors as a disco the previous year, the building of Xenon had been a well-known porn theater. With that past lurking in the background, the dancing colors appeared to represent the shiny new establishment that now occupied the same place. But the image was actually something more literal, since the central attraction of the benefit evening had been announced, as you can read here, as the New York premiere of Laser Concert by David Tudor, Lowell Cross, and Carson Jeffries. This trio had been teaming up to present similar concerts intermittently for several years, where Tudor's electronic music was visualized using the laser system developed by Cross and Jeffries. In fact, the laser image that Rosenquist used for the poster was taken from one of their earlier performances. But although this work had traveled widely from Iowa City to Mexico City and even across the Atlantic, it had never been seen in New York City. And a glorious Manhattan disco seemed like an ideal place to premiere this spectacle of light and sound. The evening of February 28, 1979 started off well, as you can see in this photo of when the mayor of New York City arrived with all the people and the press crowding around him. At 8:45 p.m., Tudor and Cross activated their sound and laser systems. But no more than 10 minutes into the performance, the laser concert was brought to a sudden halt. As Billy Kluver remembered much later, we had everything set up, and he had his laser, and it was working beautifully, right? But it stops, clunk, and then it starts up a little, and then it stops. The problem was infrastructure. Cross's laser system needed water to cool the lasers from keep them going. And, as Kluver explained, since the water can't have shit in it, they put a filter in there. Except they happened to be in New York City, and the year happened to be 1979, so the dirty water was so dirty that it clogged the filters that were in place to purify the stream. Given this mechanical constipation, there was no way for the show to go on. Kluver would later reflect on the evening as one of the most horrendous situations in my life. But the gathered crowd did not appear to care, nor even take notice of the shortcomings. The program transitioned smoothly into what Xenon did best. People spent the rest of the evening dancing happily to DJ music. The fundraising was enormously successful, as Kluver recalled. We delivered like $30,000 or $40,000 the next day. Tudor, however, had other plans for the next day. He decided to leave his setup of interconnected modular electronic instruments intact and returned the following afternoon to perform the concert on his own without the laser and without the audience. His reason for doing so is mysterious, but it did take quite a long time to set up his sound system, and he considered the specific qualities of the space he performed in as being part of his instrument. And the specific qualities of the space were in fact quite specific this time. The extravagant disco Xenon had invested $100,000 in a spectacular 16-channel sound system, the most expensive ever installed in a New York nightclub. So maybe Tudor simply wished to blast his music through the multiple house speakers of Xenon. If he missed this chance, there would probably never be another. The no-audience laser without the laser was thus performed on March 1st, 1979, to an empty dance floor. The entire performance was recorded, but it was never released. One copy stayed with Tudor and was moved to the Getty Research Institute when they bought his archive shortly before he passed away in 1996. Another copy was preserved in the archives of E.A.T. at the house of Billy Kluver and Julie Martin in New Jersey. I will play a segment of that recording now.
Okay, explaining. All right, David Tudor, laser performance. Take one.
The mystery of this secret no-audience concert at Xenon seems to revolve around two questions. What did Tudor perform? And why did Tudor perform it? For the first question, I will offer an answer by carefully analyzing the material evidence left. For the second question, I will offer a speculation. But before we delve into the specifics of the material left, I should present some background story about what it was that Tudor was doing with the lasers. By the time of his performance at Xenon, Tudor had been using lasers to visualize his sound for about 10 years. And before lasers, he had used television sets for several years for the same purpose. It all began back in 1965, when Lowell Cross, who is photographed here in Ahmedabad when he went there after Tudor in 1970, but back in 1965, Cross, who was still a 26-year-old graduate student living in Toronto, attended a concert of electronic music and got extremely bored because there was nothing interesting to see. So, at home, he opened up his black and white television set and connected the output of his sound system to its deflection yoke. This essentially turned his TV into a giant oscilloscope that visualized the waveform of any two input sounds by mapping them onto the vertical and horizontal axis of the two-dimensional TV screen. In particular, when the two input signals were the same except in differences in phase or frequency, it resulted in a nice visual pattern known as residue figures, as they were discovered by Jules Antoine Lissajous in the mid-19th century, which appear to rotate or wiggle as the phase or frequency of sound changed. And now, strictly speaking, Lissajous figures are made from sine waves, but other kinds of waveforms also make figures reflecting their respective shapes. So, sound shapes would produce circular figures and triangle waves, triangular ones, and so on and so forth, as you can see the pattern here. Cross began experimenting with different kinds of audio input. Being a grad student in musicology at the time, he developed a strange theory that this instrument could be used to judge the quality of music being played through it. So bad music resulted in boring images, and good music produced exciting ones. When Tudor visited Toronto in early 1966, Cross showed him what he had been working on, and Tudor was immediately fascinated. According to Anthony Ignacio, who was assisting Cross at the time, quote, "David just thought this was the greatest thing. They would just sit there for hours playing sounds and just roaring in front of this thing, deciding who was good and who wasn't good." End quote. Cross proceeded to compose a piece for Tudor and his modified TV set. This performance was titled Musica Instrumentalis and was premiered in Toronto in May 1966 was cross-operating his TV system, which now used a color TV, to visualize Tudor music. And one example of how the visuals looked is captured in this photograph. For this performance, Tudor played an accordion-like instrument called the bandoneon that he was very into at the time, but I won't go into that in this talk. In any case, according to Ignacio, David would be the sound source. So Cross was guaranteed he was going to have a good music this time. They were going to have a great display, end quote. 2 years later, Lower Cross began developing a laser system driven by electronic music in collaboration with Carson Jeffries, who was a physics professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Around the same time, Tudor became involved in a project to create a giant pavilion for the 1970 Expo in Osaka, Japan, funded by Pepsi Cola and led by E.A.T. And one of the things he proposed in an early meeting was a shower of laser light whose output would be modified by sounds. As this block diagram of the system installed in the Pepsi Pavilion shows, music was used to activate the galvanometer mirrors that cause 4 laser beams to deflect and create shifting patterns of colored light in red, yellow, green, and blue. And you can see that in this photo of the so-called clam room in the Pepsi Pavilion where the laser system was installed. In the 9 intervening years between the Pepsi Pavilion and Xenon, Tudor worked with Cross and Jeffries to perform with the laser system at least 4 times under the generic title of Free Spectral Range. Here's a list of their dates and location. Free Spectral Range 1 was performed on February 16, 1973 at the University of Iowa, which is where Cross was working at the time. Free Spectral Range 2 was performed over the weekend of June 12th and 13th in the same year, 1973, again at the University of Iowa. And Tudor's music for each day received a separate title. One was called Laserbird and the other Laser Rock. Free Spectral Range 3 was performed 3 years later between May 21st and 23rd, 1976 in Mexico City at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. And Free Spectral Range 4 was performed a year later on May 14, 1977 at the Kulturforum in Bonn, Germany. Now these performances left behind a number of materials documenting what happened. Let me list all the ones that I could find. Now, there are several photos capturing images of the dancing laser beams, like these ones. And I think you can see, you'll notice that there's 2 different types of laser images. One where the beams are quite clear, like these ones, and another where they're dispersed like these. And this is because the laser system had 2 modes. The basic one, which was called scanning mode, which moved each laser beam by moving 2 scanners or galvanometer mirrors for vertical and horizontal axis, as we saw earlier in that diagram for the Pepsi Pavilion. And the other was called interference mode, and which used a set of solenoids, which are electromagnets, to move translucent materials placed in front of the scanners to disperse the beams. So these 2 types of images correspond to those 2 modes. Aside from these photographs of lasers, there are also several photographs taken over the weekend of Free Spectral Range 2, showing Tudor with his instruments, and these were probably taken by Lower Cross. Also related to Free Spectral Range 2, there are 2 neatly drawn diagrams showing the connection of instruments for Laserbird and Laser Rock, the 2 pieces Tudor performed on that weekend. But aside from a single recording of Laser Rock, no recording of the music performed at any of the Free Spectral Range events have been found. In other words, the Xenon recording turns out to be a very rare documentation of Tudor's music for lasers. The irony, of course, is that this time there are no photographs of lasers to match the sound. However, a different kind of visual documentation has surfaced from Julie Martin's archive. And this is a series of photographs showing Tudor with his setup at Xenon. And as you can see, these photographs show the interconnected instruments on the table quite clearly, and therefore it is possible to identify almost every instrument Tudor used for the no audience performance at Xenon and analyze how they were connected. And in the essay that I am publishing, which I will mention later, I discuss each instrument and what it does, but I will, for this talk, I will spare you the technical details because we need to get to Ahmedabad soon. But in any case, here's the identification of the instruments. Now, this collection of modular instruments and their placement on the table reveal an interesting fact, which is that Tudor's setup at Xenon resembled his setup for laser rock from 6 years before. Almost all the instruments that appear in the diagram of the latter piece are found in the Xenon photograph. Like that. Now, if we look closely at the laser rock diagram, you will see that instruments are forming multiple feedback loops where the output of the instrument is returned to its input. For instance, there are 4 small ones around these mixers here, and several giant ones that go through several instruments. This type of configuration creates what David Tudor called a giant oscillator. Like regular oscillators that oscillate by arranging feedback around an amplifier, the network of instruments arranged in multiple feedback loops can start producing sounds on their own once activated by simple trigger signals like the sine or square waves or pulse waves shown here. These giant oscillators generated recurring sound patterns that could be modified either gradually or suddenly by manipulating the knobs and dials of individual instruments in the loop, as can be heard in this recording of laser rock. Now, given the fact that Tudor had been using this type of giant oscillator configuration since the early days of his collaboration with Cross, with a few modifications here and there for each performance, it makes sense that he would have reused it for the laser concert at Xenon. But there is something very strange here. For in spite of the presence of the giant oscillator that is confirmed in the photograph, the recording from Xenon suggests something else was at play, since the sound of Tudor's performance on March 1st, 1979 is filled with recognizable tape sources, which are basically external inputs that the giant oscillator would not have needed. In other words, the music suggested by the instruments in the Xenon photograph does not match the music heard on the Xenon recording. Let's listen to the beginning of the performance again.
Okay. Explain. All right. David Tudor, laser performance. Take one.
Now, some of the sounds heard here are the so-called Pepsi Tapes, which are recordings of animals, birds, insects, natural phenomena, and laboratory sounds that Tudor assembled for the Pepsi Pavilion project and used, among other things, to perform the laser system at the pavilion, as we saw earlier. For instance, the heavy rambling sounds that, the starts the recording, which we just heard, is probably the sound of a wasp chewing the meat off of an old fishbone, which was taken from the album Sounds of Insects released by Folkware Records in 1960. But the most prominent sound that can be heard throughout the entire performance, which is a recurring pattern of bird-like chirping sounds, did not come from Osaka. And I was pretty sure about this because I remember listening to the same sound in another recording I found at the Getty Research Institute. This was a tape that was labeled Monobird, which Tudor had used in several performances in 1972. And it was the same source tape that he used for Laserbird, which was performed alongside Laser Rock in 1973. But although I could trace the sound of Xenon back to Monobird and Laserbird, I didn't know where this tape originated from. But then, as I was going through Tudor's papers one day, I found in the transcript of an interview he gave in 1984 a short note he had scribbled in the margins, which revealed the surprising provenance of this recording. Refers to Monobird, made in '69 Ahmedabad, elaborated in '72 for Munich. It was a note attached to a section in the 1984 interview, where Tudor was remembering a peculiar incident that occurred during his stay in Ahmedabad, India, 15 years before. In October 1969, just as Cross and Jeffries were developing their first laser system for the Pepsi Pavilion, Tudor flew to Ahmedabad, a city in Gujarat province in India. He had been asked to set up the country's very first electronic music studio as part of the National Institute of Design. It was a job commissioned by the members of the Sarabhai family, who had made a lot of money in the textile business in the early 20th century. In the mid-1940s, one of the daughters of the family, Geeta Sarabhai, had traveled to New York to study Western music, worried about its influence on the traditional music of her country. One of the teachers she met during her stay happened to be John Cage, who taught her contemporary music and counterpoint in exchange for lessons on Indian music. Through this connection, Tudor had also become acquainted with the Sarabhais, exchanging letters with family members and visiting them for 2 weeks in November 1962 on his own after his tour around Japan with John Cage. He visited them again 2 years later in October 1964 during the world tour of the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, whose performances in India were arranged by the Sarabhais. So when plans arose for incorporating an electronic music studio into the National Institute of Design, which was a school that Geeta's siblings, Gautam and Gira, helped establish, it was natural for them to think of asking David Tudor for the job. But this was a task that Tudor may have taken with a heavy heart, for the plan involved the use of a particular instrument that he happened to dislike very much. A synthesizer made by Robert Moog that was becoming popular around the world since its release in 1964. Tudor was no stranger to either Moog or his instruments. In July 1965, Moog provided 12 capacitance-sensitive antenna for Variations 5, a multimedia collaboration between Cage and Merce Cunningham, in which the proximity of dancers on stage to the 5-foot-high metallic poles triggered sounds performed by Tudor and Cage. Later that year, Tudor called Moog up to discuss the construction of a touch-sensitive control device, as this letter documents. But Tudor did not hide the fact that he hated the so-called synthesizers that made Moog famous. His complaint was mostly against the inflexibility caused by standardization, which resulted in predictability. As he explained in an interview in 1984, "I hated the way those machines were so predictable, and it's very difficult to make them sound, different than they're supposed to." In comparison, as we caught a glimpse of his setup at Xenon, Tudor's own sound systems were characterized by an utter lack of standardization, being composed from a lot of equipment that I built myself, where there was no question of a power supply in common, so the voltages present were constantly unpredictable. Tudor, in fact, had a hands-on knowledge of the difficulty in making the Moog synthesizer do something other than what they were supposed to do. In 1967, just 2 years before his residency in Ahmedabad, he and Gordon Muma recorded an electronic realization of John Cage's solo for voice number 2, which was included in the compilation LP Extended Voices. And this is part of the transparency score made by Cage for that piece. When I asked Moma about this realization, he told me what they did. And this is Moma here. During Cunningham tour, I think in the late 60s or early 70s, with Tudor and Cage in the background. So when I asked Gordon about this realization, he told me what they did. And he said, "For that we subverted the possibilities of both Moog and booklet synthesizers, then it began in their relatively early development. Later, he added a corrective: more subvert the Moog things, not the booklet things." To the question of how they had access to the Moog instruments, he remembered, "Well, we may have borrowed something. I don't remember what it was. Moog also had some modules that we would change back and forth. I think I traded some of them with my own." And indeed, Moog was quite good friends with Robert Moog, as shown in this photograph capturing him and Tudor with Moog. Now, there has been a discussion throughout this series of talks about how and why Tudor ended up stuck with an instrument like the Moog synthesizer for this project. But with all the above things said, Tudor may have been personally involved in selecting the Moog synthesizer for the electronic music studio. There is a letter sent from the Sarabhai agencies on March 15, 1968, which is more than a year before his visit to Ahmedabad, which asked Tudor's opinion on another synthesizer which had been offered to Gira Sarabhai for the electronic music studio. And so he says, "In reference to our telephone conversation, I have enclosed herewith the detailed specification with photographs of the Synket equipment. Miss Gira Sarabhai would like to have your advice and opinion on the same, as this equipment is offered to her for National Design Institute, with which she is actively associated. She would very much appreciate to know from you if you have any other equipment to recommend." As I said at the beginning, this is where one of the larger holes in my story appears, since aside from this letter, which I found among Tudor's papers, there should be letters sent from Tudor, probably lying somewhere in the archive of the Sarabhai family. But in any case, it is clear that Tudor was corresponding with Gira Sarabhai and her representatives about the equipment to be installed in the electronic music studio for more than a year before he went there. The Synket synthesizer, mentioned in the letter, was an instrument that the Italian sound engineer Paul Ketoff built in 1963. And Synket, the name stands for Synthesizer Ketoff. And this was a nice instrument equipped with a square wave generator, frequency dividers, filters, and modulators, controlled with 3 small keyboards. The American composer John Eaton loved the Sync-It and used it a lot, and it was also used in many spaghetti western movies made in Italy. But this synthesizer was not conceived as a commercial product, and the dozen or so models Ketov made were all custom-made one-off instruments. So it makes sense if Tudor had advised Gira Sarabhai to think of the Moog synthesizers instead. Interestingly, there is a scribble on the letter from the Sarabhai agencies in Tudor's hands, which reads 912 envelope follower, which is one of Moog synthesizer modules. Meanwhile, there was one person, at least, who must have been very happy about the whole deal, and that was Robert Moog himself. In an article titled Moog Music is Here to Stay, which was published on September 7, 1969 in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, so before Tudor actually went there to Ahmedabad, the writer Frank Peters praised Moog instrument as having, quote, made a breakthrough that electronic music has been waiting for all these years, comparing it to the long lineage of other electronic instruments right up to the sophisticated Sync-It of our own decade, which had their day in the sun but none took root. As evidence of this breakthrough, the article mentioned that there are more than 200 Moog synthesizers in the world today, nearly all of them sold in the last 2 years, and new ones are being bought as fast as universities and studios can scrape up the purchase money. An elementary school in Philadelphia has one for pupil use, so does the University of Jerusalem and the National Design Institute of India. So in any case, Tudor accepted the invitation from the Sarabhais and traveled to India in the second week of October 1969, probably the second week, if not the first, along with a whole set of Moog synthesizers, which were shipped from the Moog factory in Trumansburg, New York. And this is the photograph of that specific instrument, the Moog synthesizer, that was installed at NID, National Institute of Design, taken by Dun Karkaria, who purchased the instrument when the school later decided to dispose of it. And I got this from Alex Keefe, so I thank Alex for kindly sharing this photograph with me. And well, now among the Tudor papers, I found a series of data schematics that Moog had sent Tudor for this job. There are 21 schematics to be exact, and this is the list of those modules. And it turns out that almost all the modules on this list can actually be identified in the photograph of the NID Moog, thus revealing the specific configuration of the instrument Tudor installed in Ahmedabad. But the Moog synthesizer was not the only instrument that traveled halfway across the world with Tudor. Aside from setting up the electronic music studio, he was asked to conduct a series of workshop-like classes on electronic music. So he brought his own instruments for that. And what he brought along is revealed from a list of equipment he wrote for custom declaration. These are all instruments that Tudor was using in his performances from the same period, and it was again a mixed bag of commercial products and custom-built instruments. And here are some photographs of the actual instruments, which are now archived at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. For example, there's a commercial Lafayette mixer, several phase shifters, a mixer preamp, pulse generators, output splitter. This was an instrument that was designed by Gordon Muma, and a harmonic generator, and so on and so forth. Especially interesting among this list of instruments are the two A800 amplifiers, which look like this, and two substitution boxes, this one here and this one here, which allows switching between different values of resistors and capacitors. That's what substitution boxes do. And this set of instrument is interesting because around this period, Tudor often inserted the substitution boxes in the feedback path around this amplifier to create a giant oscillator which he described as making bird-like sounds. So maybe during his workshop at NID, Tudor showed his students how to make electronic instruments oscillate on their own through feedback. There are photographs of Tudor teaching the class found in the NID archives. And interestingly, one of them shows Tudor holding the vinyl record of extended voices, which included his earlier attempt to subvert the possibilities of the Moog synthesizer. Now, one of the participants in the workshop was Geeta Sarabhai, who apparently asked Tudor to organize an event at the same institute to present the music she had made with the new synthesizer. At least that's how Tudor told the story, though there might be materials in the archive of NID or elsewhere that reveal how things proceeded in more detail. But in any case, according to Tudor, he made all the arrangements to make this concert happen, but then Geeta suddenly got stage fright. From what he remembered in 1984, I was very unhappy when I'd gone to great trouble to arrange for Geeta to present her composition, and she chickened out. She was afraid it wasn't good enough, and so I just had to be satisfied by the fact that it would never be good enough. And this is a photo of Tudor with Geeta, which was taken in Ahmedabad in 1969. In the same having set up a performance situation with no performers, Tudor decided to take matters into his own hands. In the same 1984 interview, Tudor went on to describe what he did. And this is actually where he added the note in the margin that he's referring to Monobird. I had to make a piece, and the only thing available was this synthesizer. So I put all my gain stages into a single oscillator, and the poor thing doesn't know what it's doing. It turned out to be fun eventually. In another talk from 1985, which is a year later, Tudor again described what he had done. All of a sudden, I had to make something, so I took a couple of hours and I made that synthesizer piece. I decided that I better find a way to tweak it out. I had already done a little experimenting with the early booklet synthesizer, and a very nice technique was to load a mixer up and put it in a feedback loop. So I decided to take a single oscillator and load up all its controls inputs, and sure enough, you would think there would be 30 oscillators, but there's only one. I have to admit, I'm still scratching my head about what exactly Tudor did here. And I also discussed this with my good friend Michael Johnson, who knows much more about electronics and synthesizers than me. But there's just several possibilities that one can imagine, Tudor did based on what his quite vague description. So going back to the NID Moog, as we saw earlier, this did have a set of oscillator controller and oscillators here lined up in the middle row of the left box. And it was one oscillator controller controlling the frequency of 2 or 3 oscillators like this. And there are also several gain stages in the system, most notably the 3 902 voltage control amplifiers here and here. So it makes sense to think that he set up a feedback path in one or another for the control signals that goes through these gain stages. One other thing that I recalled was that Tudor also mentioned in his 1985 talk that every time I had to use a synthesizer or synthesizer component, I had something outboard to it that then would change the way it operates. So it's also possible that he set the feedback path outside the Moog synthesizer and inserted his own instruments that he brought along. And maybe that's what he implied when he talked about putting my gain stages into a single oscillator. But in any case, what Tudor appears to have done was to apply his method of creating giant oscillators with feedback to the Moog synthesizer in one way or another in order to disrupt its standardized predictability. This is also supported by the sound of the recording Tudor made in Ahmedabad, which Paul Purgas found during his research at NID and kindly shared with me. And this is a photo of the box of that reel-to-reel tape, which those of you who attended the last session will remember Paul showing to us. And as you can see, it is labeled birds with the word mono inscribed and scribbled out next to it to indicate probably that at least initially it was a monaural recording. I will play the first part of this recording, and you will see that the music for the most part repeats a short pattern of sine wave like chirps going up and down in pitch, which is gradually shifted as Tudor manipulates the controls here and there. The sound indeed reminds one of bird songs, characterized by what ornithologists call syllables, which are short segments of repeated patterns that birds are known to learn and perform through auditory feedback. But some of you will also be reminded of the Xenon recording that we heard earlier. As you just heard, the beginning of this recording has a strange sounds of laughter, which is overdubbed onto the Moog sounds. And so maybe this overdub was what caused the scribbling out of the words mono. The tape that Tudor brought back with him from India did not have this laughter and remained, therefore, a monobird. Monobird became the source tape for a series of performances Tudor presented starting in August 1972, using it every time in a duet with John Cage's similarly titled Birdcage. Tudor had written in those marginal notes that Monobird was made in '69 in Ahmedabad and elaborated in 1972 for Munich. This suggests that he made edits to the original Monobird tape around this time as he prepared materials for actual performance. Indeed, there are different versions of Monobird tapes archived at the Getty Research Institute. And there are 3 reel-to-reel and 4 cassette tapes labeled with slight variations in name. And the R refers to reel-to-reel and C refers to cassette. And I'll try to explain briefly the relationship between them that I have been able to figure out. First of all the cassette tapes are derived from the reel-to-reel recordings. And with the exception of C147A, labeled Monobird NX, they can all be traced back to a single source, which is this R335. And this also happens to be the only one whose title is spelled with a dash between mono and bird that seems to connect it to the initial name Tudor gave his track in Ahmedabad, which was Birds Mono, recorded in mono. It actually turned out that the 2 recordings are identical. The recording that Paul sent me and this recording that I found at the Getty, except for that laughing sound that was overdubbed in the Birds tape. Let's listen to this for a while. Now, This original reel-to-reel was dubbed onto C148, which is labeled Monobird N. So what does this N stand for? It turns out that the only modification Tudor made to this original tape was to slow its speed down by changing its playback speed. So the letters N and S attached to some of the label are actually an indication of their speed, normal and slow. And indeed, C182, labeled Monobird Slow, contains the only slow version. Contains only the slow version. Let's listen to this. Now, it might be difficult to perceive the relationship between the normal and slow versions, but it becomes apparent if you visualize them using a sequence. And there are actually notes that Tudor took when he worked on the two versions of Monobird in different playback speed, 7.5 inches per second or 3 3/4 inches per second. So the next thing that Tudor did was to create a stereo version which has Monobird in normal speed on the left channel and a slowed down version on the right channel. And this is what R9 is. This stereo recording was dubbed to C147B, labeled Monobird SX, as well as C181. The only remaining reel-to-reel tape, R196, is interesting since it is actually composed of two tracks, the second half of which is the same stereo mix of Monobird normal and slow, whereas the first half turns out to be a different stereo track, which I have not been able to trace back to R335. So this may have been a second track that Tudor recorded in Ahmedabad or elsewhere, or the original tape was modulated in some way that I have been not able to tell. This was dubbed to C147A, which Tudor calls Monobird NX. Let's listen to this. Now, it seems that Tudor did not do much to the tapes in the performances of Monobird in 1972. There's a diagram that he drew for the performances, and it shows three tape sources which are routed, rotated, and equalized, but other than the modulator inserted after the third tape source, which modulates the signal of one channel of the stereo tape with the other channel, there is nothing in the diagram that modifies the sounds of the tape. And the same was true when he reused the Monobird tapes as his input to Laserbird a year later. You can see that not much is done here either. the right channel goes through straight to the output speakers along with the X input of the laser system, whereas the left channel goes through a phase shifter before reaching the other Y input of the laser. And certain characteristics of the Monobird recording would have made it suitable for the visualization of sound. For instance, the clean sine wave-like single note melody would have probably resulted in a clear visual movement, which would repeat and gradually vary. The changes in speed would have created a nice counterpoint of sorts in the dance of the laser beams. 6 years later, Tudor again picked up the Monobird tape for his laser performance at Zena. Unbeknownst to all, he was blasting the sounds of the Moog Synthesizer Gone Wild through feedback from the $100,000 sound system. Or more accurately, he was blasting the recording of the sounds of the Moog Synthesizer he had performed in Ahmedabad a decade before. Which is to say that quite pertinent to the occasion, a concert in a glittering New York disco, Tudor was DJing. Using a recording of a giant oscillator instead of performing a giant oscillator was actually something Tudor did quite often. Yet strangely, even when he did so, Tudor tended to act as if there was no difference between the two things, as if using recorded sounds was somehow completely equivalent to performing the giant oscillator live. But this would indeed be the case if what lay at the receiving end was the laser system. What matters for the visualization of sound is what sounds do, not where they come from, the effect and not the cause. There is no difference between live and recorded sound as far as their function on the receiving end is concerned. From what the photographs and the recordings revealed, Tudor's setup at Xenon appears to have been a mixture of Laser Rock and Laser Bird, two giant oscillators, each dedicated to controlling different colors of the laser probably. The fact that one oscillator was recorded and the other performed live would not have mattered, not to the assembled crowd or the laser beams. But then the shit hit the fan, quite literally, and the performance had to be stopped. When Tudor returned the next day, there was no audience and no laser. But he still performed the material in spite of it all. Why did he do that? In addition to the focus on the receiving end, there is yet another way that the distinction between live and recorded sound would cease to matter. Obviously, what the Monobird tapes recorded was not the Moog Synthesizer itself, but a particular performance of the instrument that took place one day in early December 1969 in Ahmedabad. Then, Tudor had used that recording of his performance in his subsequent performances with John Cage, only changing the speed of his playback or playing the same recording at different speeds simultaneously. Now, John Cage had once famously argued that records ruin the landscape. And what he meant by that was that recordings ruin the liveness of musical performances by freezing its sound into a constant repetition of the same. But Tudor had other thoughts, as he explained in an interview in 1988. Even if I do make a recording which is used during a live performance, I also do that in a live space so that it has an imprint of my hearing and my perception. He had done exactly that at Xenon. And if one were to be more precise, the list of things leaving an imprint on the recorded sound grows exponentially from Tudor himself, the space of performance, the particular tape recorder and cassette tapes used, and the rooms they were stored in to the specific environment in which they are played back and all the equipment involved along the way. In other words, no landscape needs to be ruined since each act of recording and each act of playback is essentially a live performance, as any disco DJ surely knows. The no-audience laser concert without the laser thus created yet another entry in Tudor's personal discotheque, a word that originally means library or an archive of recordings. A recording that could be used as material for yet another performance to come. Its receiving end would be waiting in the future. 40 years since the Xenon concert, the time seems ripe for the future. Now, before I end, I like to place this story, like I said in the beginning, in a slightly larger yet slightly more personal context, which should explain why on earth I am here today talking about David Tudor, who I did not have the pleasure of knowing in person. I will lay this out in the form of chronology. December 1969, David Tudor is in Ahmedabad and makes the original Monobird tape. February 1970, Tudor flies to Japan to join the final work of installing and programming the overall sound system and laser deflection system at the Pepsi Pavilion, which opens in mid-March. Meanwhile, Fujiko Nakaya develops a way to make fog sculptures in order to enwrap the entire pavilion with fog, as you can see in this photograph. Julie Martin works with Billy Kluver to assist the artists before all the E.A.T members are driven out of the pavilion by Pepsi Cola Corporation for spending too much money. January to February 1971, Yvonne Rainer is selected for E.A.T's American Artists in India program and embarks on a 6-week-long trip across India. She keeps a travel journal where she documents her impression of many Indian theater, dance, and music performances she encounters. She goes back to New York entertaining fantasies of giving up dance. May 1971, Yvonne Rainer makes a piece called Grand Union Dreams, which reflects her experiences in India. The piece is neither dance nor theater, but something in between. It is the first piece in which Rainer sets characters for her performers who are cast in one of the 3 categories of roles which are clearly hierarchical: mortals, heroes, and gods. Gods are performed by the more famous dancers. Trisha Brown appears as one of the gods, and she does not enjoy the experience. When asked about her choices, Rainer answers, quote, "That came after seeing a lot of theater in India," end quote. Critics call the piece her most problematic work. Soon after this performance, Rainer stops making dance and becomes a filmmaker. And you can see the 2 photographs from that performance. November 1971, Trisha Brown, who had reluctantly played God in Grand Union Dreams, travels to India with Jared Bark as part of American Artists in India. August to December 1972. Using the tape he made in Ahmedabad, Tudor performs Monobird alongside Cage's Birdcage. They do 3 performances this year, one in Munich on August 30th, another in Persepolis in Iran on September 8th, and a third at the State University of Albany upon the invitation of George Charabe on December 9th. June 1973. Tudor performs Laserbird and Laser Rock as sound inputs to the laser system at the University of Iowa. December 1973 to February 1974, Tudor revisits Ahmedabad and stays with the Sarabhai family. In early February, towards the end of his stay, he falls and fractures his left wrist. This would be his last visit to India for a long time. He would make his very last trip in November 1990 as part of the Cunningham Company India tour. July 1974, Tudor visits the island Knaverskär in Sweden along with Billy Kluver, Julie Martin, and Fujiko Nakaya. They stay on the island and investigate its nature for an upcoming project Tudor had conceived after their expulsion from the Pepsi Pavilion. After converting an entire pavilion into a musical instrument, Tudor now wishes to turn an entire island into a musical instrument. March 1979. Tudor performs the no-audience laser concert without the laser at Xenon. June 1980. Trisha Brown choreographs Opal Loop, a collaboration with Fujiko Nakaya, which uses her fog on stage with dancers. The water droplets making the floor wet becomes a big problem. Billy Kluver steps in to help and builds a system to keep the floor dry so that dancers won't slip. Fujiko and Trisha become good friends. Now fast forward 25 years, during which time I was born, spring 2005, Fujiko introduces her friend Trisha Brown to Japanese artist Kenjiro Okazaki, and they begin a collaboration. I join as a translator, meet Trisha, and later become the robot operator for the robot that Kenjiro designed for the collaboration. I start touring with Trisha's company. I meet Julie Martin at one of the rehearsals. She is very friendly and taking photos of everybody. Sometime in 2006, through my involvement with Trisha, I start learning about the Judson Church dance movement, which she was part of. Aside from Trisha, I become very interested in a choreographer named Yvonne Rainer, and especially a strange theater dance piece she made in 1971 called Grand Union Dreams. On one of our tours, I asked Trisha about it, but she said she doesn't remember much. I start planning a reenactment of Grand Union Dreams with theater director Yelena Glossman. Spring 2007. Yelena and I visit Yvonne Rainer in California and ask her about Grand Union Dreams, which she tries to remember and goes over her notes with us. She cannot recall many of the details, but says that her materials have been sold to the Getty Research Institute and suggests I go there. November 2007. As a strange consequence of our collaboration with Trisha, we are invited to robot conferences around the world every year. Our second year is in San Diego, and after a presentation, I decide to stay a couple of more days to enjoy California. I suddenly recall Yvonne's comment that her materials are at the Getty. I contact the Getty to see the materials related to Grand Union Dreams. Getty replies saying that the materials are in their archive, but they are still being processed, so I cannot see them. They tell me that I can nevertheless visit the special collections room if I want. I look what else they have and find the David Tudor papers, which I didn't know existed. I request several boxes and take a day trip to Los Angeles. I am blown away by the amount of materials Tudor left behind and decide almost immediately to study them. 2 years later, in September 2009, I moved to New York to do just that. In the course of my research, I become friends with Julie Martin. October 2010, we reenact Grand Union Dreams in Tokyo. September 2018, I am forced to leave the US because of Donald Trump and return to Tokyo, having almost finished the manuscript of my very long book on David Tudor. January 2019. On the day that I finalized the manuscript of my long book on Tudor, I jump on the plane and travel to India for 3 weeks. Having been immersed in the writing of the book, I have not made any plans nor preparations in advance. Right before I leave, I come to my senses and I realize that I can actually visit Ahmedabad on this trip. I quickly email Alex Keefe, whose wonderful essay on Tudor's activities in India I had read online, and ask Alex for advice, which he very generously gives me, along with a list of good restaurants I should not miss. I get the contact of Doon Karkaria, the present owner of the NID Moog Synthesizers. I emailed Doon and ask him if I can see the instrument. Doon sends me a long, warm reply saying that he is determined not to let anyone see the instrument, even, quote, if the ghosts of John Cage and David Tudor made the request, end quote. I then contact the Sarabhai mansion, and I am told to email Anand Sarabhai, who is supposed to have passed away in 2013. I start imagining Ahmedabad as a city of ghosts. I arrive to Ahmedabad and stay over a single weekend. I visit the Sanskar Kendra, the Le Corbusier building whose photograph I had seen in Alex's essay, somehow thinking that this was where NID was located when Tudor was there. I see the NID campus across the street, but think that it's a new campus that did not exist back in 1969. I walk around the Le Corbusier building, which now houses a nice city museum. I try to imagine where Tudor's electronic music studio and the Moog Synthesizer might have been installed. I find a nice kite museum on the first floor of the building and think how lovely that is, since Tudor spent a lot of time in the 1980s working with his partner Jackie Matisse Monnier, who was a kite artist. I learn that Ahmedabad is also a city of kites. After spending the afternoon at Sanskar Kendra, I leave the building and I'm suddenly caught with a strong urge to go to the bathroom. It's probably the curry that I ate for lunch. I cross the street and sneak into NID, escaping the guards at the gate. It is dark already, and I can't make out the shape of the buildings covered with trees, but I do manage to find a bathroom, and I am saved. Afterwards, I walk around the building seeing posters of events on the wall, students hanging out, but then the guards find me, and I'm escorted out. September 2019. Julie Martin emails me out of the blue saying she, Anna Lund, Jakob Kierkegaard, and Tobias Kirstein are going to Knavashar in a few days to see how the island is doing after 45 years. She asks if I want to tag along. I hesitate, but decide to do rock, paper, scissors with my son Avi and go if I win and don't if I lose. I win and hop on the plane. On the boat back from the island, Jakob tells me about his project with Julie of releasing the recordings from Tudor's no audience concert at Xenon and asks me if I would write an essay for it. I had heard the same recording at the Getty, and I knew that the primary source tape for this performance is the Monobird tape that Tudor recorded at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad. I tell Jakob I would be delighted to write the essay. October 2021. After my David Tudor book is finally out in March, I am invited to give a talk on Tudor's visit to Ahmedabad as part of a lecture series organized by the National Institute of Design. That same month, the double LP Monobirds is released under the direction of Julie Martin and Jakob Kierkegaard, accompanied by a long essay I wrote telling the story of Tudor's birds who originated in Ahmedabad more than half a century ago, so that they may travel further into unknown futures. Thank you.
Thanks, you. This is yeah, it's such a very fascinating lecture, absolutely riveting sort of story. In fact, like network of stories that you've taken us through. So, I mean, my head is still buzzing with a lot of like ideas and questions that I'm still kind of processing. But I'd also like to just let the audience know that you can put in your questions in the Q&A box or the chat as you please, and we'll get to them.
I'm also posting the link to the label Topos, which is releasing the Monobirds LP.
Absolutely. When is the release?
It's supposed to be ready. And so it's supposed to, there's a page which they put up, I think, yesterday.
Right.
So it should be ready. And there's an email address there on the website, which you can contact to order.
Sure. Yeah, but it also actually, the constructed timeline at the end, it also really sort of helps to get a peek into your own, artistic and research interests that drove you to explore the vast archive of David Tudor's work, oeuvre, and, practice. And, one of the interesting things is that the Moog has been an object of conversation every session. I mean, in a way, it also, I think, kickstarted the desire to sort of hold these sessions and lectures for us, only to actually realize once the sessions began that it wasn't really directly connected to the E.A.T histories. Right. So it's also this very sort of controversial object which slips into these gaps and holes that you pointed out in the beginning. And I think one of the questions that it kind of makes me wonder about is also related to the idea that you presented of Tudor's preoccupation with the uncoordinated, the uncoordinated, or this need to sort of unsynchronize, and that instance of where he puts all the gain stages into one oscillator and then creates this kind of like crazy loop. So this. And I think in another part in your book, there's an interview that you kind of mention, which also speaks of him wanting to turn the sound inside out, create a sound by turning it inside out. So I'm sort of being able to relate it also to this idea of the uncoordinated. And I'm also wondering how the Moog, for instance, features in this impulse of his, so does it kind of like does it restrict it, or does the restriction in a way offer ways for him to explore other ways of using it which others haven't before, or
I think people have different opinions about the Moog synthesizer. David Tudor has his, and like a lot of other people, other people would think differently. Um, and the way Tudor approached the Moog, as he says in different interviews, and how he tried to like make it unstable, was part of his aesthetic of trying to like make the relationship between instruments unstable and indeterminate, and kind of create music from there. I personally, I'm not quite sure about how I feel about, for example, something like Moog Synthesizer. But at the same time, one project that I'm doing right now is try to make music that can only be performed and listened and experienced over Zoom. This system that we're using now. And people have different opinions about Zoom as well. Zoom and Moog kind of sounds similar, but and my way to think about this, kind of aside from like what Tudor was thinking about Moog synthesizers, is that it's very useful to actually delve into the system and examine and explore what it can do and what it cannot do, in order to actually criticize it. So in a way, like the best way to criticize the system is to just use it in the way that it was not supposed to. And I think you can do that with Zoom as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, it makes me curious to also like want to know more about how you're sort of doing that with your current project. And also because, the distinction that you sort of spoke about between liveness and recording, which Cage sort of very explicitly makes and Tudor wants to kind of blur and complicate it, is a very pertinent kind of distinction in where we are at now with, the sort of virtual remote pandemic, situation. So yeah, I mean, could you just shed a little more light on how you're thinking about the virtual ensemble?
Oh, the project that I'm doing right now?
Yeah.
Well, well, the way that I'm thinking about this, and it's a collaboration with the composers at the University of Virginia, and so it's not exactly my piece where I get to do what I want, but I've been using Zoom as in my classes because I was asked to teach experimental music from one of the Japanese universities that I work at. And I didn't want to do that because it seemed that like teaching experimental music is the least experimental thing that you can do. But then this whole COVID thing happened, and I realized that all the classes had to be taught over Zoom. And I was at the university I was working back then was a music university, a music college. And all the like professors were complaining how they cannot teach music over Zoom. And so it occurred to me that well, I mean, I would be interested in teaching an experimental music class if it was a class that actually explored the Zoom, the system that we're using to teach the class, as a specific instrument with its own biases and affordances and constraints. And so I started doing that, and it turns out that Zoom is a very nice pedagogical tool because there's degrees of indeterminacies embedded in the system. Some part of it which you can control, and others that you can't. For example, you don't. It's very difficult to actually determine in advance how each audience experiences what you're doing, because they're all like using different devices, different like speakers, headphones, and so on and so forth. So even if you try, you spend money and you get all these equipments to like the best microphones and so on and so forth, to create music with the best sound quality that you can like convey over Zoom, it doesn't really happen. It doesn't necessarily happen that way, over there. The other thing that's interesting is that with Zoom, there's always something to see. And so in my the way I think about this is that music becomes kind of like something very close to movies. Because you always have to take into account the fact that there's something to see. And even if you like kind of neglect that and decide to not use anything, you are seeing something on the screen. So the images become more, well, I wouldn't say more important, but the relationship between images and sound becomes more important than what the sounds do by themselves. So there's all these things that make Zoom a very nice pedagogical tool to engage with, because it forces the students to to experiment and also deal with the indeterminacies, which precludes what they want to do.
Right. Sure. Yeah. And I think we also have a lot of questions and comments pouring in the chat. So one of the so Robert asks, he says, a fascinating lecture. With respect to tape C181, what does B signify? Backwards, some of the material in that final recording you played sounded like it includes reversed monobird material.
Could you say where is that question?
So the Q&A chat at the bottom.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So the question right at the bottom by Robert.
Where does B signify? Let me see. In C8, I think this is just like the side A and side B of the tape,
right?
Rather than backwards.
Right. Okay.
But maybe I like I said, there's one the R196. There's one recording that I haven't been able to trace back to the Monobird recording in Ahmedabad. Maybe reverse Monobird material might be it.
Yeah, that's possible. Right.
Maybe you're right.
Yeah. So John asks, was there a connection between the laser system in the clam room of the Pepsi Pavilion and the audio system in the dome space? What signals were driving the laser system?
As far as I know, they were using the Pepsi tapes to drive the laser system in the clam room. And Julie can correct me if I'm wrong. And so in a way, there is a connection, because several of the programs that Tudor made, in the dome also employed the Pepsi tapes. I'm not sure, in terms of the Pepsi tapes that were used to drive the laser systems, which ones were used. Yeah, but so there's that connection, at least.
Right. John, do you have any follow-up questions on this? We can bring you on and unmute you if you like. Also, John D.S. Adams says that he has some thoughts on why Tudor used recordings as source material.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so maybe we can we just bring him in onto the panel?
I'm here.
All right. Yeah. Hi, John.
Hey, John.
Hi. Hey, you.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good.
So the thought that I had was, and this is sort of knowledge derived when I was working with him when he was working on the neural network plus piece for Cunningham. And there was a lot of generation of recorded material from the neural network synthesizer that would ultimately be used in the performance of the piece. And the reason, it was a very practical reason he did this, is because often that very very unpredictable feedback system that he set up with the neural network synthesizer was, he couldn't count on it to produce consistently acceptable sound material for a live performance. So I was thinking, as you were talking about the reasons why he made recordings of the Monobirds, is that it sounded to me, especially when you played them back, there is a certain amount of unpredictability, I imagine, when he was performing them live. And in order to sort of to perform a piece on multiple occasions with a consistency, having those performances pre-recorded, like sort of preliminary performances in a way, pre-recorded, allowed him to sort of make a presentation that was consistent and sort of desirable to him.
Right.
So that's just sort of a thought I had as to one of the reasons why the recordings were made and then used sort of in a, as you said, DJ sort of fashion. I never thought of it as a DJ.
Well, he was in a disco, so Well, I mean, I agree with you. And one of the things that I was going to like quote, but I didn't, was this thing that Tudor says. It's you know, it's from this a conference that he was a panelist at in 1989 or something like that. And the moderator asked a rather dull question of like, if you know, back in 1952 when he was involved in this specific performance, whether he thought that what he was doing was going to make history. And the way that Tudor answers, saying, well, my answer to that question is that one thing leads to another. And it's a phrase that I like very much, you know, because, you know, it reflects on the chronology that I presented at the end, but also in terms of like why he kept using the Monobird tapes, because there's a specificity in the way that he used them. So first, he used them for Monobirds, which is the performance he does with John Cage, where John Cage is performing a piece called Birdcage. So there's that bird connection. And then a year later, he uses that as his input for the laser system, which he calls Laser Bird. And probably the reason he used it for the laser, I mean, I mentioned only briefly about this, had to do with the quality of the sound. You know, it's basically a single like a tone melody with not much like overtones. And also, like, you know, he has like one thing going slower than the other, and so it creates a sort of like counterpoint, I think, when it's used as input to the later systems. And then later he reuses again for Xenon, and there the connection is, you know, that laser. So each of these like instances where he used the recording is connected not through like just one like overall like principle, but it's just like one thing leads to another, is the best way to I suppose to see it. And Julie says that, you know, and he did use it for so many works, but you know, they are specific in that sense.
There's also another question from Shreyasi who says, what a wonderful presentation. You thoroughly enjoyed all the chapters and your narration. The part about David Tudor carrying a number of instruments during this travel was quite a revelation. We've always been preoccupied by the Moog modular. Makes one wonder what else was happening in the sound studio at NID, or NDI as it was called back then.
Yeah.
So is there any other sort of peek into the other instruments that he was carrying that you'd sort of like to share?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, they're all the standard setup of Tudor's performances from this period. It's funny because I had used this specific list of instruments to show that he has been, so he on the list there's 5 phase shifters, and I think in my book or elsewhere I used this material to to argue that David Tudor suddenly starts building all these phase shifters around this period, and you can see it because in the custom declaration form that he made several 2-3 years before, there are no phase shifters, and suddenly there's 5 here. But I had used this specific list, but I had never associated it with the National Institute of Design until this talk. And many things I like that because, like I said at the beginning, I could not do any new archival research for this presentation. So I kind of delved into the materials that I have and see, if I can make use of them in this context, specific context of this NID presentation.
Right. Yeah.
Which is kind of the same thing that Tudor does, when he travels with a specific set of resources or instruments, and then he has to put them to use depending on a specific situation that he encounters, so.
Right. And there's also a lot of photographs, I think, that have been shared by Joel. Thanks, Joel, for that. And I'm sort of skimming through all the messages. There's a whole bunch of them. I hope I'm not missing any question. Yeah, so somebody, Matt asks, in what part of the NID building was the studio located in?
So that I shouldn't answer that because I went to the wrong building, and
but we hope you'll be at the right one once you come again.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. But do you guys know where it was?
Tanishka would like to respond, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. We don't really know. Shreyasi has poured over the photographs trying to identify. But what we do know is that, the building over the years, it's been used quite flexibly because it's a modular structure, has this grid, and things keep changing. So we do get, many times when people visit, they tell us, oh, in our times, this was here, that was there.
I see.
So things keep moving around, but what we do know is that in the sort of intention of the way spaces were organized in the building, the intention was that workshops and studios would be on the first floor of the building. So it's quite possible that it was somewhere on the first floor, and we seem to understand for some of the photographs that it might have been a room that is overlooking the lawns.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Coming back to an earlier point which was raised, I was going to answer that, but I kind of moved on. The relationship with E.A.T and this Tudor's stay at Ahmedabad, and I'm not sure if Julie's here anymore, but so Julie was saying that this wasn't like E.A.T thing, right? But at the same time, I also found this, which I didn't show. I'm gonna share the screen again. This is a letter that was sent from Gira Sarabhai to Billy Kluver in 1969 November. So while Tudor was there in Ahmedabad, and he so they're exchanging letters, and he says we have had discussion with David, and he has given us a list of the participants at E.A.T Pavilion in Osaka. So at this time, E.A.T is working on the pavilion in Osaka, which is relatively close to India than flying all the way from the U.S. And then they're basically talking about who they can invite from the Pepsi Pavilion project over to India. And David, feels it would be very useful to have lower cross, for example, and that actually, happened after that. He also suggests other for example Anthony Martin, who was also associated with the Pepsi Pavilion, which I don't think happened. But there was this exchange, I think, and I asked Paul about why the recordings. I guess it's not here. In one of the photos that he showed of these reel-to-reel tape boxes, I think on the inside it said Mr. David Tudor from New York, E.A.T. or something like that. If I remember correctly,
Right.
I suppose. So there was this connection that people on the NID side was making, and probably had to do with their with Gira or somebody else's plans of linking this thing to E.A.T. in one way or another. So I think although the fact what I'm trying to get to is that although this project in itself may have not been a E.A.T. project, there was a connection that I guess both the E.A.T. and NID was trying to make and use this project to get there.
You.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Oh,
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me. I think there are two.
Yeah.
There are two things. One connection with the Sarabhai family was with Vikram Sarabhai and the group from E.A.T. that went to India in December 1969 to do a project that had to do with educational television for the satellite project, but was based in the group was based in Ahmedabad. So at that point, Billy Bob Whitman, who was there, may have had contact with NID or with I don't know. We stayed with Manorama Sarabhai. So I think there was that connection that E.A.T. was there. And then I just want to say that Lowell, it's very interesting. Lowell did come later. And I think it's in your presentation or somewhere that he actually worked with Gautam to try to do a laser performance. Do you want to talk about that?
I think that was, I forgot who mentioned that. It was in one of the previous sessions.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But he
yeah.
Not only did he work with the studio, but also he had this idea of doing a laser performance.
Right.
And they tried to borrow a laser, etc. While he was there.
Well, one funny thing related to Cross's stay. So he writes this report, right? And where was it? He writes a report of his 4-week stay at the National. So let me share it. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
So this is a report that he wrote after his stay, and where was it? He says one of the things that he did was to rewire the patchboard to remove inconsistencies, ham and feedback producing loops. And he's there right after Tudor was there. So this might be something he took care of after Tudor, played around with the Moogs.
To make it an instrument that more people could use, that the students could use, perhaps, and it became more educational or more useful for them.
Yeah.
It's funny.
There's one more question from Dhananjay here, who says that visual archives are visual cues in a particular historical time frame. And in that regard, what is the information that can be retrieved from audio archives?
Where is that question?
It's come in the chat.
In the chat. Oh, wait.
And it's also there in the Q&A. Oh no, it's not. Okay.
Well, I suppose, I'm not sure if I understand what level of specificity this question is trying to get. I mean, one answer to that is what I, my whole presentation today, I suppose.
Exactly.
Oh, could you send out the link to the recordings?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we will upload the recordings soon on YouTube, and we'll be sharing the recordings. Dhananjay, in case there's a specific thing that you're looking at, just feel free to unmute and ask. But yeah, in a way, today's entire presentation lecture testifies to the sort of relevance of audio archives and the kind of speculative field that they open up in trying to examine archives, or like actually not just look at archives as a source, but also as a site that further opens out into, further questions and speculations, which you sort of foregrounded today in very interesting ways. So I think, I mean, there are a lot of sort of messages pouring in that are thanking you and congratulating you on the presentation.
Thank you.
So, I mean, it is sort of, we're kind of close to closing time. So maybe with that, I think we can begin to close the session and also the series. So thanks for a very, very riveting session. And we hope to carry on the conversations with you and all our other panelists in the times to come. It's been a very generative set of conversations, and I think each session has also been instantiating its own set of provocations and revealing these sort of missed connections and uninvestigated sort of spaces that open up more findings, more revelations every time have been sort of happening. And I think we can, I'd actually like to hand over to Shirsi, who would be further reflecting on the series and who's been the collaborator in putting this together, but also has been very rigorously involved in the processes of archiving at NID. So Shreyasi will sort of summate the sessions and also share glimpses of the possibilities that shapes and forms that we're imagining some of these conversations to take over the times while we are still continuing to digest these. So Shreyasi, over to you.
Thanks, Suvani. Thanks a lot. The E.A.T in India series has shed light on various histories of Ahmedabad and early modernism in the newly independent India during the Cold War period. Although E.A.T occupies a minuscule place in the archives at NID, it was rather exciting as we went on to discover how several projects and journeys that took off in Ahmedabad during this historic period went on to shape students, artists, our cultural milieu, and of collaborations that could be and couldn't be, and the imagination of what could have been. Looking at the E.A.T in India period with Ranjit Menon and Joanna Griffin, we saw creative freedoms and the possibilities of relooking at and for lost objects, and how after decades, what it could mean to reenact these events and projects, the discoveries made in the process. We saw several connections between various programs at NID and ISRO, which comes as no surprise since these institutions were grown and overseen by the Sarabhai siblings. With Julie Martin, we dove deeper into the workings of E.A.T and the creative possibilities it forged and how. In Gujarat, it revealed the preoccupations of those who participated and what utopia could mean. Jared Bach, one of the American artists in India, shared his wonderful journey via his personal archive, informing us about how it impacted his artistic practice and more. Alexander Keefe compelled one to think about the various facets of the set time period and take note of the big players within the larger cultural diplomacy of various local and global networks. These networks also brought, as discussed earlier, artistic journeys of people at the NID Sound Studio that Paul Purvis chanced upon. paving a way for us to further see Nakai's deep investment in David Tudor's life and work, which again sprung from a chance encounter during their visit to Getty Music Institute. These insightful stories of collaboration, controversies, and crises sparked several discussions and questions, especially between Suvani and I. And every conversation with the speakers, both before and during the session, led to the greater question of how to think of an archive in our current political climate and what it could entail, and the ways in which one can address the lacunae that we have been identifying as we move in and out of the archive. Although this is the concluding note of this theme, but it is as much a beginning of finding more and finding ways to delve deeper and invite further engagement from all of you. With this, I would like to invite Tanishka for final words and to share further plans and surprises planned after this series and for the series. Thank you.
Thanks, Shreyasi. There are no final words really. But before I move into the most pleasurable part of today, which is thanking all those who have made this possible, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite our director, Praveen Nahar, who's been with us throughout the series, engaging from various locations that he happens to be in. Thank you, Praveen, for making that effort, and we'd love to hear some remarks from your perspective. And to tell all our attendees who are here, Praveen has been a faculty member in product design at NID, teaching for about 20 years before he took up his current role in leading the institute from 2019.
Yeah, thanks, Tanishka, Suvarna, and Shreyasi. I think I really enjoyed being part of that, but of course, I mean, it's not my field, but at the same time, I think I tried to follow most of it. I think really great contributions, all of you. I know Ranjit for a while, and we initiated this conversation, and he came to NID to work with product design students to actually reinvent or rediscover some of this. And I really like the way everybody has put things together. Ranjit, Joanna, Julie, Paul, Alexander, and today was the fascinating contribution from you, Nakni. I think it is very late for him in Japan, I suppose. But what intense and fascinating deliberations, and there's a lot of value in of this research, with reference to the educational programs, and it actually can draw a lot of lessons. Revisiting this actually bring a lot of lessons, in the historical moments, what happened, with the E.A.T and NID, or also each session also introduced narratives and connections that has been part of this, lesser known histories of this part of the world. And this has been a very valuable also for those who are studying and researching in new media, experimental media, interaction design, film, exhibitions. And also it has connected all of us, I think, across cultures and geographies through the medium of webinar. I think we have learned a lot in the last 1.5 years of how do we rediscover these connections and bring everything so easily to everyone. And I think this series itself will become an archive to investigate things further. And really, my compliments to the archives team and the session moderators, for such a great series and the programs. And I hope that we continue to develop many such programs in coming times. And I also understand that NID Archives will be launching its digital collection, for the public access very soon, as soon as end of this year or early next year. So thank you all, and great work.
Thanks, Praveen. It's been amazing to have your constant support. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of Dr. Lalita Polaru, who is the head of the Knowledge Management Center, where the archives currently is housed. The entire KMC team, also our IT team, accounts, and Naresh Bhai, especially, who's been helping us. A big thank to our guest interlocutor for the series, Suvani Suri, for putting this forward together, all the time that she spent in it. She's sort of been really sort of working with Shreyasi, who's our in-house archivist from the archives team, for the last 3 months almost, supported by Bhakrati Rashtrapal and our photography design interns, summer interns, Dhananjay and Ashin, who've really sort of taken charge of all the tech and many other things. Our great poster designs by graphic design student Sharmishta Poda that you must have been seeing on our Instagram posts. And of course, all the attendees who have come in and the speakers and guests, from Ranjit Menon to Kristen Ekholm, Joanna Griffin, our former director Ashok Chatterjee, Manvita Baradi, Julie Martin, Jared Bach, Anna Lund, Alexander Keefe, Paul Fergus, and today you, Nakai. Thank you. And you've been really amazing, spending so much time in making these fabulous presentations. Before we sign off, I'd like to just quickly say what's next with public programs, because I know many people have sort of been with us through this journey and looking forward to what's next. We're going to take a short break, but we're going to be back with another series soon. And so please watch out for that announcement on our Instagram. And all the talks that are part of the E.A.T in India series will be published on NID's YouTube page soon. And we'll announce that to all of you via email and also on Instagram, of course. We'll be working on a surprise, which will be announced later this year, hopefully some form of publication. So stay tuned. See you in the next season. Goodbye and good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye, you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.